A year and a half after the outbreak of World War II, the outlook was bleak for the Allies. Britain was suffering heavily from the German Blitz and resorted to buying supplies from the United States at a rapid rate. They could not keep purchasing materials for long, and such heavy spending bore dire consequences for the future. The Lend Lease Act, passed by the U.S. Congress on March 11, 1941, gave President Franklin Roosevelt the power to lend supplies to the Allies. World War II demonstrated that all nations are part of a global community. The Lend Lease Act showed that responsible nations have certain rights to each other's resources and also have the responsibility to aid each other in their crises. In 1935, Congress passed the first of a series of neutrality acts, banning the United States from aiding foreign countries at war, but as Germany and Japan began to invade and conquer their neighbors, the United States became less comfortable with neutrality. In 1937, as tensions rose in Europe, Roosevelt said, "Let no one imagine that America will escape, that America may expect mercy, that this Western Hemisphere will not be attacked." Many Americans felt that, due to our physical separation from Europe, we would not be drawn into their war. In November 1939, Congress revised the Neutrality Acts, allowing merchandise to be purchased in cash by other countries and transported to their respective country in their own ships. This was called cash and carry. However, it soon became clear that cash and carry would only be a makeshift arrangement. Britain's needs could only temporarily be met through cash and carry, and soon its flaws would have to be faced. Britain would not have enough cash to make it through the war, and the constant drain of British dollars would deal a great blow to Britain's and the United States' post-war economies. Additionally, cash and carry came to be seen as an attempt by the United States to exploit Britain's crisis for financial gain, and to some extent it was. Germany was making effective propaganda of cash and carry, saying it was an attempt by the Americans to drain Britain of their gold, an approach employed until after the passage of the Lend Lease Act. We cannot stand before the world and say, "We will help save democracy, we will help to save civilization," and in the next breath say, "We will do so only provided you pay in cash." Senator William E. Borah. In the summer of 1940, Britain was struggling. Germany was sinking British supply ships, preventing thousands of tons of supplies from reaching Britain each month. British losses had more than doubled in 4 months. Many in the United States had not yet realized that their safety was completely dependent on the survival of Britain. They had a right to aid from the United States, and it was the responsibility of the U.S. to provide them with legitimate help.
The United States had to exercise that responsibility because it alone could.
Roosevelt believed aiding Britain was necessary.
If Great Britain goes down, it is no exaggeration to say that all of us, in all the Americas, would be living at the point of a gun loaded with explosive bullets, economic as well as military.
Franklin Roosevelt's safe re-election in 1940 gave Britain hope for increased aid from the United States, but they were to be disappointed. Lord Lothian, British ambassador to the U.S., told American reporters soon after the election, "Well, boys, Britain's broke. It's your money we want." Britain had reached its financial breaking point. During one of the coldest winters in their history, Britain was barely holding on. They lacked food, had scarce heat, and dwindling hopes. "We were hanging on by our eyelids," recalled Field Marshal Lord Allenbrook. In early December 1940, Churchill sent a long, desperate letter to Roosevelt. It reached Roosevelt while he was on a cruise in the Caribbean. This letter, though it did not contain the concept of Lend-Lease, gave Roosevelt the idea. In it, Churchill said, "I do not believe that the government and people of the United States would find it in accordance with the principles which guide them to confine the help which they have so generously promised only to such munitions of war and commodities as could be immediately paid for." Churchill later classified this letter as the most important I ever wrote. When Roosevelt returned to Washington, he announced his idea. America could ship their war materials to Britain, and Britain would return or replace them after the war. This would turn the United States, as Churchill dubbed it, into the arsenal of democracy. In the same press conference, Roosevelt gave what was to become the famous garden hose analogy. "Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire, and I have a length of garden hose 400 or 500 feet away. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire. I don't say to him before that operation, 'Neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15, you have to pay me $15 for it.'" The drafting for the bill was soon finished, and it was introduced in Congress. The 2 months of debates that followed primarily focused on the large amount of power given to the president. Many also claimed the bill was tantamount to a declaration of war, calling it a war measure. Wisconsin Governor Philip La Follette stated the purpose of Lend Lease was to guarantee Britain an overwhelming victory, regardless of the consequences of war for the people of the United States. However, it may have been in the best interest of the United States, if not to declare war, to prepare for it.
Most of the support derived from people who critically realized that even if the United States did not want war, it still might come toward us anyway. And in that respect, we needed to aid and equip our potential allies with the means with which to resist Axis aggression.
There is evidence that the supporters of this act sincerely hoped that the Allies, with the help of Lend Lease, could win the war without belligerent intervention by the United States, and if not, the act would prepare the United States for war. The Lend Lease Act was passed on March 11, 1941. In the early months after the Act's passage, many orders were made for Lend Lease, but the United States did not have the production capacity to contribute much material aid. So in 1941, Lend Lease's effects were mostly psychological, not material. It built a strong relationship between Britain and the United States, easing previous tensions and frustrations. The other major psychological effect of the Lend Lease Act was boosting the morale of the British. Winston Churchill wrote in a letter to Roosevelt, "They burned a large part of the city of London last night, and the scenes of widespread destruction here and in our provincial centers are shocking. But when I visited the still burning ruins today, the spirit of the Londoners was as high as in the first days of the indiscriminate bombing in September, 4 months ago." But over the course of the war, the Lend Lease Act did have a tremendous material effect. Edward Stetson has said, "On December 7, 1941, the threat from our enemies suddenly materialized in the skies over Pearl Harbor. By then, although we had far from enough weapons to take the offensive at once, we were far better prepared to protect ourselves than we had ever been before at the beginning of a war." The economic and military value of Lend Lease was considerable. It cost an estimated $50 billion, dwarfing the Manhattan Project and other major military expenses. Over half of the Allied munitions were made in the United States. The U.S. provided 400,000 trucks and jeeps, nearly 2,000 railroad locomotives, large quantities of petroleum products, and $1.6 billion worth of agricultural goods. Without American production, the Allies could never have won the war. Joseph Stalin. Edward Stetson wrote, "Lend Lease has become a vital mechanism through which the United Nations were able to combine all their resources in men and materials against the Axis. They were helping to win the war for all of us." The United States expanded their aid in the form of Lend Lease to a total of 45 nations. This was the end of the United States' non-involvement, turning them from a friendly merchant for the purpose of business to an active participant in the affairs of the world. While the United States and other global powers sat watching, the Axis conquered country after country. Only when the United States supplied aid were the Allies able to stand against the Axis. If influential countries refuse to intervene in the affairs of a global community, disaster follows. The Lend Lease Act placed the United States in a position to become a global superpower.
Of this dynamic and innovative manufacturing economy would carry the United States into the rest of the 20th century as the world's leading economic power.
The Lend Lease Act built strong allies in Europe and ended U.S. isolationism forever. Although Lend Lease aid was cut off in 1945, it continues to influence the United States foreign policy. The Marshall Plan was a continuation of the Lend Lease Act's ideals. That same philosophy of aiding other countries, as well as the affirmation of the rights and responsibilities to share resources, is deeply ingrained in U.S. foreign policy. When World War II concluded, the United States offered aid to the rest of the world to help rebuild their countries, creating many allies including Germany and Japan. After World War I, the Allies left the defeated Central Powers to fend for themselves. If the United States had offered that same aid, perhaps World War II could have been prevented. The Lend Lease Act psychologically and materially aided the Allies in World War II. Without it, the outcome of the war may have been very different. But just as significant, it taught the world a vital lesson in the rights to other nations' resources and the responsibility to aid other nations in their crises. It was a seminal moment in teaching the world the rights and responsibilities of coexisting in a global community.